Diversity, equity, inclusion are terms we are hearing more and more. Our next guest is the Dean of the FAMU College of Law, Deidre Keller, and she's here to talk about the role that these things play in racial justice. Good morning.
Good morning.
So tell us, what is the meaning of racial justice?
Right. So when we talk about racial justice, a lot of times those conversations are spurred by a tragedy. So most recently, George Floyd's killing, the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. And when I think about racial justice, I really think in broader terms, right? Not just how do we avoid these tragedies, but really how do we ensure that we live in a society where marginalized folks can thrive, right? So I really try to get away from the survival framework to a more thriving framework of racial justice.
Okay, and so I hear social justice and racial justice quite often. Is there a difference?
There is a difference, although of course these terms are complementary, right? Social justice really speaks more broadly to other kinds of axes of power, so think class marginalization, gender marginalization, et cetera. And racial justice is really a focus on the history of marginalizing racialized folks in America in particular.
Okay. And so then what is the role that diversity, equity, and inclusion will play in racial justice in higher education?
Absolutely. So in higher education, we have a real opportunity to have an impact on, for example, economic inequality, right? So when we talk about racial justice, again, in that broader thriving framework, we're not just thinking about criminal justice, right? We're also thinking about economic inequality, wealth inequality, health disparities, right? The whole gamut of issues that we know there are disparities along racial lines here in America. And so higher education can really play an important role in social mobility for racially marginalized folks. One of the things that we know is actually HBCUs are really good at impacting social mobility for their graduates. And so when we talk about diversity in higher education, we're really talking about opening up opportunities for racially marginalized folks to attain higher education, and that has impacts on their income and on their wealth, et cetera.
Okay, and so now what is the importance of having a diverse student body and faculty, or is one more important than the other?
I would say that they are equally important. Having a diverse student body really has positive impacts on student experience. Many times we see college as the first time that some folks have encountered people from diverse backgrounds, right? If we look at our K-12 education system, it is still pretty segregated by race. You wouldn't think that, right? 70 years post Brown versus Board of Education. But in fact, what we find is that K-12, because we are still pretty segregated in where we live, K-12 education is still pretty segregated by race. And so a lot of times, the first time people are in class with persons of other races and ethnicities is in college, right? And so that can have a really important impact on decreasing racial prejudice, for example. But in addition to that, what we find is that students from marginalized backgrounds, it's important for them to have others who look like them in the classroom as well, and at the front of the classroom, right? So we know that students thrive when they have mentors and professors who basically are role models for them and demonstrate what attaining that degree can result in.
That's interesting. As you were speaking, I was thinking about, so we're encouraging diversity and inclusion, and then, so what would you say is the most advantageous thing then about an HBCU versus a school that's more diverse toward racial justice?
Right. So what we actually see is that HBCUs have great outcomes for their graduates. So if you look particularly at STEM graduation, HBCUs are far punching above their weight class, if you will. And There's an interesting question about why that is that I don't think is answered in the literature, but we do know as a matter of outcomes that the vast majority of students who go on to graduate education in STEM graduated from an HBCU. You see that actually across professions. A lot of lawyers, Black lawyers, graduated from HBCUs at some point in their academic career. A lot of Black health professionals graduated from HBCUs at some point in their higher ed experience. And so HBCUs make up like 3% of the colleges and universities in the country, and graduate something like 25% of the lawyers in the country.
Yeah, I for one can attest to the support and how valuable that was at FAMU College of Law. So there is something to be said about the support and the comfort level and the nurturing that goes on.
Yeah, it's community. Yes.
But at the same time, not to live in a bubble and to encourage this diversity, equity, and inclusion as a part of what's necessary for racial justice. Yes. Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing those things with us and giving us something to think about. It's always good to learn something like this, and it's certainly good to see you in person.
Thank you. Likewise.
As you heard in our discussion, there are some very valid points for enhancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education toward racial justice. Stay tuned for more Legal Connections.